All right. And what we're going to do today, we're going to finish up that last group activity. Some of the groups finished and already turned it in, which is fine. Though if you want to revise anything, feel free and just send it back to me. We'll spend about 10 minutes doing that, just finishing up the last activity. So if your group is already done, just you can chat for 10 minutes or whatever. Then we'll come back together after that and begin talking about inductive generalizations. So we'll get started on the next thing. I also want to really quickly go over the group activities that were from Monday. I haven't gotten all of them returned to you yet, but I've gone through them all at least, and I'll get the rest of them returned to you after class. And just go over the answers to those problems a little bit too. So that's my plan for the day. Any questions or thoughts or comments before we get started? Oh, and by the way, I posted the final exam date and times are on Canvas as well. So our final exam is going to be due the Thursday of final exam week. It'll become available a couple days in advance. You'll have 2 days to do it, just like with the previous exams. It'll be the same format as all the previous exams, and it'll be due the end of the day of the Thursday of the final exam period. All right. Let's begin by just going over that group activity from last class. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I know. Come on. See if I can get this to actually work. There we go. All right. So we're talking about different kinds of appeals to authority. And these looked a bit better on the whole. People did a better job with this set of problems than they did with the first set, which is what I'd expect. So that's good. So here we had someone argues that alcohol is psychologically and physically addictive and cites the comments made on the topic by a psychologist who predominantly studies how opioids are addictive. Here, the relevant concern is that this person doesn't seem to be the most authoritative expert in the field. And so the third criteria. All right. They are indeed expert in a relevant field. But it would be better, and the argument would be better, if they were actually experts on the effects of alcohol itself. Not on the effects of opioids. How serious is the violation? I would say this is indeed a concern, but probably not a huge concern. This is cause for perhaps greater skepticism. As there perhaps could be relevant differences between alcohol and opioids. That this expert's just not familiar with. But the mechanisms of addiction are probably similar enough that what this person has to say will still be valuable. So we might have a greater degree of skepticism, or we might have less confidence in the conclusion that we've come to in this case on the basis of this argument. But still, the person has enough expertise that it seems to make sense to still listen to what they have to say to some extent, at least. Next one, this is probably the trickiest case. So you have a doctor suggests that given your symptoms, you should get a blood test done to rule out any especially dangerous diseases as the cause. He recommends that you go to the nearby clinic for the procedure, which he also owns. So what's the issue? The issue is conflict of interest. Sorry, this is not the most argument. Right. How big of a problem is this? Well, okay, why is the conflict of interest a problem at all? It's a problem because the doctor has an incentive to call for the blood test beyond expertise. The problem is, well, this might be sort of a especially egregious instance of this with the person actually owning the clinic. The problem with this is in general is that in a capitalist society, all doctors have conflicts of interest in this regard, right? Like basically, how is it that doctors make money? They make money when you do stuff with them, be it getting a blood test, be it getting an x-ray, be it getting an exam, right? I mean, so doctors always have an incentive to want to do stuff, want you to do stuff for them. In this particular case, it seems like given that the person does have some particular set of symptoms, that were problematic enough that the person went to a doctor in the first place. It would probably be best in this place to just take what the doctor says with a greater degree of skepticism. Perhaps we should get a second opinion. And that's a step below just rejecting what they say outright. This seems to be another scenario where more caution seems to make sense to be sort of called for, have less confidence in what it is that the doctor has said. Indeed, maybe a less confidence enough that you want to make sure a second opinion, get a second opinion, make sure other doctors in fact agree. In this case, if it's just a blood test, you probably wouldn't get a second opinion just about that. Yeah, I mean, in this case, it doesn't seem as if it's severe enough to just reject what they say out of hand. But indeed, these kinds of conflicts of interest are really things to be concerned with and to be worried about. Any questions on either of these first two? What I was seeing mostly looked pretty good from the groups, so that's. But I just wanted to go through it anyways. Any last questions? All right, let's go. Let's do the remaining two. The third one is gonna. Sorry, it's not the right thing. This third one is going to depend a little bit on what you interpret from the Harvard Economist. So we have someone argues that raising the minimum wage will harm the local economy. He cites his evidence for his belief in an academic paper currently unpublished written by a Harvard Economist. All right, the paper is unpublished. That means it hasn't undergone peer review. So that's the concern. How big of a problem is this? Well, it kind of depends. Let's say that this Harvard economist, so someone who's at Harvard, that's meaningful, that's worth something. Let's say this Harvard economist has 30 years of publishing high-quality peer-reviewed papers. Okay. So this person has a long track record of getting stuff through peer review, getting stuff through the peer review process. And indeed, that this current paper is under review, but just a decision hasn't been reached yet. In that case, right, we should probably just express some more skepticism of the result. Because there's enough other features, right? This guy has a 30-year track record of publishing really good material, right? Of having gotten stuff accepted through the peer review process before. We don't know about the specific result, so maybe we still have a little bit more skepticism, but this is still sort of an established thinker in the field, someone who's worth taking seriously what they say. On the other hand, say that this Harvard economist is just an adjunct, like me, right? Someone with very little or no publication background. Though I do have a couple publications, but. Or let's say that the paper has outright been rejected for publication. Right, so it's not still under review. It's actually the review sort of came in, and the other experts said, thumbs down. This paper is not good enough. Right? Then we should reject the testimony of the expert. Then there's enough other factors going in, calling into question this person's authority or competency, such that we should then, not be willing to just sort of blindly follow along. So this is, I thought probably the most nuanced and the most interesting case, because it really does sort of depend upon a lot of other factors. I mean, the gold standard is peer review. That is indeed what you should look for and what you should expect. But there's all kinds of other factors that sort of determine how much does that matter. And so these are the kinds of things, at least, to be aware of when you're thinking about these sorts of things going forward. So I thought 3 was probably the most difficult of these questions. How's everyone feeling about that? Does anyone have any questions or comments about that 3rd question? All right. And let's finish up with the 4th one. The 4th one, I've graded this pretty easily, pretty loosely by and large. So we have someone claiming that you should refrain from eating meat for health reasons. What are the concerns? What should you want to know? You should want to know what the person making this claim, what this group's specialty is. Right. Are they doctors? Are they nutritionists? Are they ethicists? Are they this, that, the other? What are they? Have their claims been peer reviewed? Do they have a conflict of interest? Or a problematic bias, but not just any bias, but a bias that's actually hindering their ability to be sort of impartial experts in this regard? Is there agreement? Do other experts in the field agree with this conclusion? And basically just so on down the line, just going through those list of 7 criteria, basically. Right. Yeah, I graded this one pretty loosely, pretty lightly. So any questions on that assignment? All right, I'll finish getting the rest of those returned to you all, hopefully during my office hours after class. For now, I'll send you into the groups. We're going to take about 10 minutes in the groups to finish up the activity from Wednesday. If your group is already done, again, you can just relax for 10 minutes. You're chill, talk amongst yourselves. If your group wants to turn something in but wants to revise it as a result of having done the homework and done the quiz, that's fine too. So you can also sort of revise anything that you might have already turned in and then just turn it in again by the end of the class today. Yeah, looks like everyone is now back. Excellent. All right, so let's get started with the new stuff for today. Let's get started talking about statistical generalizations, or inductive generalizations, as they are called. So we've been talking about statistical syllogisms. One way you could sort of think about what statistical syllogisms do is statistical syllogisms go from I know what's true in general, so I'm trying to figure out what's true in particular. Inductive generalizations kind of do the opposite. They know what's true in particular, or at least they have some sense of what's going on in a particular case, and then they try to generalize for that what's true in general. That's the sense in which this is a generalization. We've seen arguments like this before when we were doing some of the fallacies. They also get called statistical generalizations rather than inductive, but same difference. When we were looking at the hasty generalization fallacy, we were looking at a mistake in a sort of inductive generalization, right? So what was the hasty generalization fallacy? It was when, my car broke down and it's a Subaru, so all Subarus must be bad cars, right? I sort of go from particular cases to all cases. But presumably there's some number of Subarus that I could have discovered had broken down that it would start to become reasonable to conclude that the cars had a problem, that the cars had some sort of difficulty within them. Right? Figuring out where that line is, that's where we're actually going to start looking at this as a specific kind of argument. So we're going to sort of get to return to anecdotal evidence and the hasty generalization fallacy. We're going to add a new fallacy to the list, the fallacy of biased statistics. And we're going to sort of talk about how it is that people can go about sort of making these generalizations in sort of normal circumstances. So let's just look at some examples of these first before we start even talking about analyzing them really specifically. So if you're doing a quality control study, right, the way these studies normally work is that you get, for example, 100 Subarus, or 100 Subarus are sent to some sort of mechanical site, and the mechanical site will check and evaluate what percentage of those 100 Subarus that we've been sent were damaged, and then infer how likely is it that all Subarus are to be damaged in some sense. Right? Another context, once you see these, is opinion polls. I think actually this is sort of a particularly fascinating case. Something that I actually want to talk about today is I want to talk about whether or not the polls were wrong in 2016 when they said that most likely Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidential election. I actually want to talk if they're wrong, because they didn't say Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. They said she was most likely going to win the election. That doesn't ensure necessity. So does that mean then that the polls were well constructed, or were they poorly constructed? We'll actually talk about this a little bit today. Scientific research also frequently uses generalizations of this sort. So if I'm doing animal testing, for example, right, or even if I'm doing human testing, I don't test my drug on every single human. I test my drug on a group of humans, and then if the drug was effective within that group of humans, I assume that it will be effective for all humans or some large percentage of humans. Right? That's, again, an inductive generalization. You go from sort of a small group to a larger group. These arguments are going to be closely related to analogical arguments. I mean, you could sort of characterize inductive generalizations as a kind of analogy, and that's not wrong. The difference is this is a kind of analogy that really relies on statistics. So the difference is basically just math. But since we're not going to actually dive into the math or the statistics heavily in this class, the way you're going to actually analyze these two different kinds of arguments are going to be similar. You'll see some overlap as we sort of go. So let me give you sort of just a formal definition of what kind of argument we're talking about. Talking about arguments of the basic form, X% of observed, F's are G's. This is a description of what we're going to call the sample group. Therefore, X% plus or minus of all F's are G's. This is a description of the population. And so let's give a concrete example of this. 45% of polled Colombians are satisfied with how the government is handling the economy. Therefore, 43 to 47% of all Colombians are probably satisfied with the government's handling. All right. So the sample group is the group of Colombians that got polled by the study. The overall population is all Colombians, and indeed that's going to be really important. You actually want to, for these arguments, make it really specific what the sample group is. We've got as our sort of percentage, the percentage in the sample was 45, so we're saying, that's should be 47, sorry. We're saying about 45%, so 45% plus or minus, the margin of error is plus or minus 2. So those are sort of the parts, in this case, of this argument that I've given you. So this is just all the broad, rough, generalized form of this kind of argument. Let me just stop for a second. Does anyone have any questions just about that, about sort of the form, the formal structure, what I mean by a sample group, what I mean by a population? I'm going to use those terms in particular a lot. We'll talk more about margins of error probably on Monday, I'm guessing. But we're going to be talking a lot today about what I mean by a sample group and what I mean by the population. So are people reasonably clear about what I mean by those two? All right, good. So the reason I was saying that these arguments sort of resemble analogies is that in effect, what you're going to be analyzing is how similar is the sample group to the overall population. There'll be more to it than that, but basically, if they're very similar, you probably have a good generalization. If they are relevantly dissimilar, you've got a bad generalization. There'll be more to it than that. We'll talk about sort of specific ways that we're going to talk about sort of gauging this idea, this sort of similarity we're talking about. This is called representativeness. The sample group must represent the overall population. If it does, you got a good inductive generalization, and the better of a job it does representing the overall population, the better your inductive generalization will be. Again, just want to sort of pause for a second. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts at this point? All right, good. Then let's start just talking about the criteria that we're going to use to evaluate this kind of argument. Just like I said last time with statistical syllogisms, there's sort of two ways we could talk about inductive generalizations. We could talk about them using an enormous amount of math or without using an enormous amount of math. I'm going to go the no math route, right? We could indeed, and if you take advanced statistics classes, UL might spend an entire semester talking about how to analyze these inductive generalizations mathematically. You can actually measure all kinds of surprising stuff. You can actually sort of measure how representative your sample is. You can measure how likely there's something to be wrong with your sample group. And you can calculate precisely how large you should say the margin of error is. So there's all kinds of in-depth math we could do. We're not going to. This isn't a math class. So we're going to talk about these inductive generalizations without using any math. And so therefore, again, we'll be able to speak on it relatively quickly. My guess is we should get done talking about these on Monday, and then maybe do a group activity either late Monday or Wednesday, and get done with this kind of argument form. So let's talk about the kind of criteria we're going to be using to evaluate these arguments. Right? Not necessarily the mathematical criteria, the more sophisticated criteria we could use. How are we going to evaluate these arguments? The only concern, the only thing you should be talking about is the representativeness of the sample group. In fact, every answer should begin exactly the same. I want to see this first sentence as the first sentence of every single one of your answers. This is a good inductive generalization because the sample group is representative. This is a bad inductive generalization because the sample group is not representative. And then I'll expect you to obviously say a little bit more why it is representative or not representative, but this really is your concern. This is the only thing you should be analyzing, the only thing you should really be looking at when I ask you to tell me, are you looking at a good or bad inductive generalization? So this should be your first sentence in every single one of these problems. When you're giving me reasons for it being representative or not, there's going to be two basic criteria to consider, and we're really only going to worry about one of them. So the first criteria, the sample group must be sufficiently large. Right. All right. Now, how large does it need to be? You need math to actually say. So as a result, we're not going to worry a great deal about this first of these criteria. It is indeed relevant. It will come up in some cases. I talked to 3 of my friends, and they all thought the economy was being handled really well, so therefore all Americans think the economy is being run well. That's obviously too small. But by and large, precisely how large the sample group needs to be really requires a great deal of math to calculate. This is indeed something that you can calculate, and it depends upon a great many factors. So let's at least talk about some of the factors that go into the calculation. Some things that you might matter, that might be relevant, is first of all just how large is the whole the population itself. Second, you might need to know how uniform is the population. Really uniform populations, you can get away with a lot lower sample sizes than you can if you have very diverse populations. And again, other things we might need to know, we need to know what kind of sampling method are we actually using. Depending on the method, we might well need larger or smaller sample groups. Again, all of this is stuff that's well worth sort of considering, keeping it in mind, but we don't really have the capacity to sort of answer this question of how large does the population really need to be on the basis of what we're talking about in this class. You just need math to do it. So by and large, just unless, again, it's sort of obviously too small, right? Unless it's obviously the hasty generalization fallacy, don't really worry about this first criteria that much. It's something to consider, it's something to keep in mind, but it's sort of beyond our capacity to talk about. an argument that violates this first criteria? Commit the hasty generalization fallacy. Or depending maybe the anecdotal. Depending on sort of precisely why I violated. Did I privilege my own case unduly, or did I just not look at enough people in general? So sort of another way of thinking about those two fallacies that we discussed a bit earlier in the semester. They're when your sample group is too small. So let me just pause for a second. That all good. Again, one way that I see people go wrong on things like an exam or on homework problems or quizzes or whatever is people just argue, oh, the sample group is obviously too small, when it's actually not too small. It's just, I would recommend mostly not really looking at the second criteria unless it's egregious. But in fact, samples groups can be quite a bit smaller than you would think and still provide us meaningful or useful results. Most medical testing is done on 50 adults. And that's somehow supposed to stand in for all adults in the world, all the billions of them, right? And indeed, if the sample group was selected well, it actually might. It actually may well be representative just with that small number of 50 people. And again, opinion polls about sort of national politics are usually done on the basis of at most 2,000 people. 2,000 people are supposed to represent all 300 billion American, not 300 billion, sorry, 300 million American citizens. Again, if you pick that 2,000 people correctly, it might even well be right. So don't worry so much about the size, worry about the second criteria far more so. Any questions or thoughts about that? All right. I'm going to introduce the second criteria now. We're going to need to talk about it more on Monday, certainly, but we'll at least get started with it, get started thinking about it now. The second criteria, the diversity present in the population must also be present within the sample group. I just qualify this as the relevant diversity. So let's do a very concrete example for this. Right? And this should be a relatively straightforward one, I'm hoping. Okay. So let us say I want to know what all Americans think about Social Security. That's my goal. So that's my overall population. My overall population is all Americans. Let's say, so therefore, how am I going to conduct a survey to try to figure out what Americans think about Social Security? Let's say I call up people who are currently receiving Social Security. And ask them what they think. This is my sampling method. What's wrong? My hope is your sense should be this is going to be a really bad idea. So why? Why is that not going to be a good sampling method if I want to know what all Americans think about Social Security? Who gets Social Security? People 65 and up. On the basis of my sampling, yeah, old people, someone's suggesting. Yeah, that's right. Not me yet, so even older than me, in fact. If my goal is to know what all Americans think, and I only sample people who are currently receiving Social Security, so people 65 and up, I'm going to get a really misleading sample group. I'm going to get really misleading results, right? Because presumably people who are currently receiving Social Security feel differently about it than, say, you all, who are, what, 40 years away from ever possibly seeing Social Security. You all probably have very different feelings about Social Security than the people who are currently receiving it. You probably have a different sense of it. You probably have different objectives with regard to it. You probably have different concerns with respect to it. And if I only sample people who are currently receiving it, I'm going to get biased statistics. I'm not going to actually represent the diversity of the American population, which includes some people over 65, includes some people close to needing Social Security, maybe 40 and up, and includes some people a long ways away from getting Social Security, most of you all. Right? So that's what I mean when I'm talking about the relevant diversity in the population. My sample group needs to include Americans of all age brackets in order to accurately gauge what it is that all Americans actually think. And why is age? Because age presumably matters. Age is presumably a relevant factor. Now, I don't probably need to make sure I include Americans of all heights, because probably how Americans feel about Social Security isn't going to vary very much on the basis of height. Height's not an especially relevant factor. Age presumably is. What are some other relevant factors? Maybe gender would be a relevant factor. Maybe political party affiliation would be a relevant factor. Maybe economic status would be relevant factors. So I need to make sure I include all of that. If you want to put it this way, demographics. I need to make sure all of those demographics are properly represented in my sample group. We'll talk about how we can actually go about ensuring this a little bit more next time, but I want to end with a little bit of a joke. So there was a study done, I believe this is actually a real study I heard about when I was in high school, so in the 90s, where a study was done to try to figure out what percentage of car crashes were lethal, what percentage of people died in car crashes. And they discovered, shockingly, that car crashes weren't really dangerous at all, because they went and interviewed people who had been in car crashes, and amongst the people who responded to the interview questions, all of them were still alive. What's the problem? Only the people who were still alive could return your survey. So you're not going to get responses from the dead, right? This is an example of a obviously sort of amusingly non-representative survey, right? Because it doesn't really reflect the people who died, right? And so what we'll talk about next time is what are some methods we can do to try to ensure that our sample group is as representative as possible. All right, so we're at the end of class for today, so we should be in good shape. We'll finish up talking about these inductive generalizations on Monday. We might have time to start the group activity. We also might not, so that could go either way. We'll see how that goes. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. I'm going to try to get caught up with some grading, get the rest of those last group of daily assignments back to you all. Otherwise, there won't be any homework or quiz due on Monday. So have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.